Negli ultimi giorni abbiamo osservato una crescita rilevante legata all'XRP Ledger. Dati diffusi da Sentiment evidenziano come XRP si sia sostanzialmente separato dal gruppo dell'altcoin, registrando ulteriormente un aumento superiore al 14% e superando anche la soglia di resistenza dei $2,50 per la prima volta negli ultimi giorni. Al momento i wallet con almeno 1 milione di XRP detengono complessivamente 46,4 miliardi di token, dopo aver accumulato il 6,5% in più soltanto negli ultimi 2 mesi. Inoltre l'attività sugli indirizzi è cresciuta in modo esponenziale a marzo, arrivando a un volume di wallet unici che interagiscono con la rete pari a circa 6 volte quello dei mesi precedenti, e questo è davvero incredibile. Aggiungiamo anche che questo rialzo qua che abbiamo avuto è strettamente connesso all'annuncio in cui la SEC ha ufficialmente ritirato il proprio ricorso contro Ripple. Infatti il CEO di Ripple, Garlinghouse, ha già descritto questo evento come una vittoria netta per l'intera community cripto, riferendosi in particolare a quanto accaduto il 19 marzo. Però detto questo, benvenuto sul mio canale, io sono Andrea e se sei nuovo spero che alla fine di questo video decidi di iscriverti. Sono partito con questa premessa qua perché secondo me questa tendenza è destinata a continuare. Ritengo che assisteremo a un'ulteriore espansione dell'XRP Ledger e di tutto il suo ecosistema nelle prossime settimane ma anche mesi, soprattutto perché l'attuale scenario delle criptovalute, sebbene appaia complesso, potrebbe migliorare nettamente. Ci sono state molte novità, per esempio in termini di adozione istituzionale e di normative che potrebbero influenzare la traiettoria del mercato in modo rapido. Si parla poi spesso di stablecoin e anche delle leggi potenzialmente collegate, come il cosiddetto Genius Act, che potrebbe rappresentare un catalizzatore sia per XRP ma sia per tutto il settore cripto. Da non trascurare poi il discorso sullo staking degli ETF, che potrebbe sbloccare volumi di scambio decisamente più elevati. In questo momento poi il settore cripto potrebbe non apparire così rialzista, in gran parte a causa della guerra commerciale e delle discussioni sui dazi. Tuttavia, se queste tensioni iniziassero ad attenuarsi e se le attività a rischio tornassero in primo piano, considerando anche il calo significativo del dollaro, potremmo vedere un cambiamento drastico praticamente da un giorno all'altro, non appena la tensione si sposterà di nuovo verso gli asset più speculativi. Inoltre credo che la prossima ondata rialzista innescherà un forte FOMO, perché sarà proprio il momento in cui molte criptovalute e altcoin incluse potrebbero superare i loro massimi storici. Oltretutto anche Garlinghouse di recente ha partecipato a Blackwork Summit, dove ha rilasciato alcuni spunti interessanti su ciò che potrebbe accadere quest'anno. Secondo quanto riportato poi da Subject With, Garlinghouse ha accennato che i fornitori di servizi di pagamento negli Stati Uniti non hanno reagito in modo sufficientemente rapido a queste tecnologie e che proprio questa mancanza di reattività potrebbe in realtà rappresentare proprio la chiave per sbloccare nuove opportunità. Ascolta attentamente.
What's your pulse on where people are going to start? Are they going to start with payments? Are they going to start with custody? Are they going to start with accepting stablecoins? What's your sense?
Well, I'll start by telling a quick story that I'll leave unnamed, but back to some of the regulatory, frankly, bullshit we've had to deal with. One of Ripple's payment customers actually debanked. We had deposits. So we're behind their firewall from an infrastructure point of view, and their compliance team decides they can't bank us. During this past administration, we got debanked, which you're kind of like, oh my God, like this has got to be, you got to be kidding me.
I remember it.
But look, I think that there will be different strokes for different folks. We are seeing some tier one banks lean into custody as because they have customers and they see the direction of tokenization of real world assets, the need to have a scalable, robust custody solution. For some customers, that is the entree point, and that's one of the reasons why we bought this company a couple of years ago, almost 2 years ago. Others, look, they are fundamentally more of a payments infrastructure play, right? I mean, certainly around remittances and some of the payment providers. And again, U.S. payment providers have not been as proactive around some of these technologies. And I think that may unlock now. So I know it's maybe an inadequate answer in some ways, and I'm not answering the question. I just think it's going to depend upon the type of bank. Some banks think of themselves more as around the custody side of the world. But I do think one of the fascinating things, and I think Sergey on stage earlier was referencing, stablecoin legislation I think is close. I have heard from some tier one banks that they may issue their own US dollar stablecoin. And hard for me to predict how that plays out. Yeah. But that also is evidence that they're leaning in a way they haven't before. And again, if there's one thing I would emphasize to this audience, we are underestimating the tailwinds from the shift of the last 6 months. The largest economy in the world has been quite hostile to our industry and is now moving the other direction quickly. And I think we underestimate those tailwinds.
Yeah.
e io condivido pienamente la loro visione. Siamo, a mio avviso, ben lontani dal comprendere la portata di ciò che sta per avvenire e del cambiamento imminente. Recentemente addirittura Trump ha ribadito la necessità di una sorta di superpotenza Bitcoin durante proprio il Digital Asset Summit, e come si può notare negli ultimi tempi la SEC ha assunto un atteggiamento inaspettatamente favorevole nei confronti delle criptovalute e tutto il panorama cripto sembra davvero proiettarsi verso una nuova fase. Se poi guardiamo al caso Ripple, ormai sostanzialmente concluso, basta tornare a gennaio per ricordare come Morgan Stanley e anche Bank of America avessero dichiarato che il settore finanziario avrebbe abbracciato le criptovalute a patto che i regolatori statunitensi lo consentissero. Ora, con questa grossa nube di incertezza sulle cripto si sta diradando, non posso fare a meno di ripensare al mio vecchio video, a una cosa che avevo detto a gennaio, in cui ricordavo che Ripple aveva confermato come le banche americane fossero pronte a utilizzare XRP dopo la vittoria già nel 2023, e all'epoca parlavamo di una vittoria soltanto parziale, come sottolineato anche dalla CNBC. Ma adesso che è arrivata la conferma di un successo totale al 100%, è lecito domandarsi che cosa significhi tutto ciò per le banche statunitensi, e a mio avviso siamo veramente a un passo dall'apertura di vere e proprie grandissime opportunità. Monica Long ha usato un'espressione simile e credo che stiamo per assistere a una svolta epocale intorno a Ripple e anche XRP. Prima di proseguire volevo parlarvi di questo exchange che uso per tradare, esattamente Femex, è uno dei migliori exchange al momento sul mercato, dove è possibile tradare sia spot sia futures, oltre più di 4.000 coppie di criptovalute, e abbiamo anche l'opportunità di prendere in prestito le criptovalute e ovviamente usufruire dei soldi che abbiamo preso in prestito per fare trading o qualsiasi altra opzione che abbiamo in mente di fare. Oltre a questo abbiamo la possibilità di metterli anche in earn le nostre criptovalute per ottenere un rendimento annuale fino anche al 10% su alcune criptovalute, su alcune stablecoin. In più, come vi dicevo, abbiamo la possibilità di tradare sui futures. Come potete vedere è una dashboard classica in qualsiasi exchange, dove possiamo fare anche un'analisi tecnica, dove abbiamo un order book, dove possiamo inserire i nostri ordini a limited o a market e giocare a leva anche fino al 100%. Ovviamente prestate attenzione a giocare a leva perché il rischio aumenta. È inoltre anche attiva la competizione di trading su Femex per il periodo pasquale, dove è possibile vincere premi fino a $45.000. Se volete partecipare troverete il link qua in descrizione, dove otterrete anche un 20% di sconto sulle commissioni a vita. Inoltre su Bloomberg è stato dato risalto a Garlinghouse, il quale ha sottolineato che la SEC ha ritirato definitivamente il proprio ricorso contro la società, e a questo punto la questione principale rimasta in sospeso è se valga la pena battersi per recuperare i $125 milioni. Ascolta attentamente.
This has been a long battle. How much certainty does this provide? Is the entire case over?
So this provides a lot of certainty for Ripple, for frankly me personally, because the SEC had sued me. The SEC has abandoned their appeal, and so they filed suit in December of 2020. We won on the key parts of the case in the summer of 23. Judge Torres made a ruling that XRP in and of itself was not a security. That's almost a verbatim quote. The SEC filed an appeal about 8 months ago, and what they've now agreed is that they're going to drop that appeal. We still have a cross appeal pending, and so we go from being defendant really to plaintiff. So we now are in the driver's seat to determine how we want to proceed.
Are you dropping it?
We're going to see. It feels a lot better to be on the offense than the defense. You know, 4 years, we spent over $150 million defending that case. Not just for Ripple, but for the whole industry. I think it was really important that this SEC, the Gensler SEC, was really trying to bully and continue lawfare, filing lawsuits and lawsuits and lawsuits against crypto companies. That's over now, and I think that's great for the U.S. crypto industry and, frankly, great for crypto at large.
I mean, to that end, if you're looking at a new SEC, why not drop the case at this point? Why not clear the water?
Well, that certainly is an option. I mean, again, it's clear the SEC has said, you know, I think in retrospect, never would have brought this case. The judge did rule in certain instances back in 2015 and 2016, some XRP sales that we sold to accredited investors, to institutions, that those had constituted a security. And so there was a $125 million fine that's sitting in escrow. We wouldn't mind having that back. That's on the table. And I think there's some nuances to how this will play out. But it was important for us, for really the whole XRP community, for them to know that the case is over. For all intents and purposes, the case is over. The SEC is no longer pursuing this.
But to that end, to your point here, the court decision had ordered you to pay a $125 million civil penalty for exactly what you're talking about. Is that $125 million paid? Is what you're saying that's still up for dispute?
Yeah. Well, it's not in dispute. I mean, that's sitting in an escrow, and depending upon whether or not we decide to continue with our appeal, we could walk away and the whole thing would be done. On the other hand, when you have a case where there were no investor harm, no investors lost any money, you're kind of like, wait, like, why are we here? And it really goes back to Gary Gensler fighting a fight that was about power grab, that was about overreach of the bureaucracy to try to take a new industry. That what we're seeing now happen in Washington is smart legislation will come forward. You're seeing that happen with stablecoins in real time. And I think you'll have a market structure bill, is what it's described as, to provide clarity and rules for the SEC and CFTC.
We will look at the bigger picture.
Right.
We're going to have you for a little while this morning. But do you think that part of this means fighting it till the very end to make sure even that part of uncertainty around being sold to certain investors classifies as a security? Is that what you are fighting for ultimately at this point?
Well, I mean, at this point, all we're fighting for is, do we want to fight to get the $125 million back? Look, I'll be honest, would I have walked away from that before they appealed, before President Trump put Paul Atkins and Scott Bessent and David Sachs as critical, key, very smart leaders in this industry to bring this industry back on shore? I would have walked away. Now you look at that, and you're like, this case in this SEC never would have been brought. And so where we find ourselves is, great, there's a clear legal victory to say XRP is not a security. That was good for the industry. But there's pieces of it that we think could be kind of cleaned up. And the question is, do we want to fight that fight, or can we come to an agreement with the SEC to drop everything? The
whole idea that this wouldn't have been brought under this SEC, have you had that specific discussion with Paul Atkins and with David Sachs?
Well, Paul Atkins hasn't yet been confirmed. He's a very knowledgeable guy about this industry and has been for a long time. But I've had conversations. I won't comment on specifics with certainly, I think David Sachs would agree that this is a case that didn't make a lot of sense in the beginning. Again, there was no investor harm. This was about Gary Gensler waging a war against this industry.
In aggiunta abbiamo anche un'altra sorta di sezione qui, in cui lui discute dell'IPO, spiegando che potrebbe effettivamente avvenire, ma che non rappresenta una priorità assoluta in questo momento. Prestate molta attenzione anche a questo passaggio qua.
Is an IPO, frankly, in your future now? We talk so much about the potential for the XRP token to be wrapped in an ETF. That is a method of listing.
Right.
So is listing possible now for you for Ripple?
Well, it's certainly something that is possible. The United States SEC under Gensler was so hostile to this industry. I mean, ironically, they approved the S1 from Coinbase and then sued them for doing the things they said they were doing. So this SEC, fortunately, is going to be, I think, very constructive and positive for this industry. So I think that's available. I think the company's at a stage where we could consider that. That being said, it isn't a huge priority. I think most companies are going public. Raising capital is something that is high on their radar. We have been in a very fortunate position to be able to grow the business organically. We're also, frankly, more proactive in looking at acquisitions. This is an industry that finally is going to be able to thrive in the United States, the largest economy in the world. And I think the industry is still underestimating the shift from the headwinds to the tailwinds. That's going to make a bigger difference than people think. And finally, the U.S. market is really unlocked.
So it sounds like what you're saying, acquisitions are almost more of a priority now than an IPO for you. So then what would you be looking for to buy, and how big are you willing to go?
Well, I'm not going to name names, but look, Ripple at its core is a blockchain infrastructure company. We sell our technologies to business, primarily financial institutions, and we'll look at other things that are blockchain infrastructure companies. I think there will be consolidation this year. There's a lot of excitement about some of the changes, and we will lean into that for sure.
E proseguendo, abbiamo anche un altro aggiornamento sulla stablecoin di Ripple, l'RUSD. Sembra infatti che ci sia grande ottimismo sulle potenzialità, al punto da prevedere che l'RUSD raggiunga la top 5 delle stablecoin entro la fine dell'anno, accompagnata da una forte espansione complessiva del mercato delle stablecoin. Ascolta.
If you think about the next forefront of stablecoins now that the US is getting toward clarity, what's possible?
Well, I think we're underestimating how big that might get. Today that market's about $230 billion. So I think some smart people think that may go up 10x in the next 5 years. I think that's probably right. I mean, the two leading players in Tether as well as USDC are both, I think, poised to do well in that market. Ripple launched our own stablecoin at the end of last year. That's already ahead of our own internal forecasts in terms of where we are at this point in the year. Still, we're small, but the goal is by the end of the year for RLUSD, Ripple stablecoin, to be one of the top 5 in the market by the end of the year. And I think the whole market's going to grow dramatically over this year.
So what does it take you to get there? Who are you pairing up with? Are you creating some financial partnerships in order to make RLUSD more of a household name?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even today we had more listings go live for RLUSD on some global crypto exchanges. Anytime you do something new, it takes a minute for that kind of, the pun of the ripple effect of seeing how that plays out. And so we're seeing that happen in real time. So I'm really pleased. And again, as I said, we're ahead of our Q1 forecasts of where we expect it to be. So we feel really good about that progress.
E per chiudere anche in bellezza, aggiunge anche un dettaglio molto interessante. È convinto che XRP verrà inserito nella riserva di asset digitali della Casa Bianca e prevede la comparsa di un ETF basato su XRP entro la fine di quest'anno.
Why do you think XRP wasn't specifically named in the executive order for the digital asset stockpile?
Well, so XRP was named by the president on Truth Social. He posted something saying that there should be other tokens, that there's going to be a Bitcoin strategic reserve and then a crypto stockpile that would include things like XRP.
But days later, the executive order didn't include it. Why was that?
I don't know what specifically was in the executive order. My understanding is there's going to be a Bitcoin strategic reserve. There'll be a crypto stockpile representing other cryptos. And I would expect that will include XRP. Look, at the end of the day, I think the stark contrast is in the Biden administration, we couldn't get a meeting with people at the White House. Now we're welcomed into the White House. And that's just a massive change. I think we want this industry to thrive in the United States. We don't want to push it offshore where you have fewer regulations.
I think the reason I keep pushing you, too, is because I think now it's widely accepted that this is a pro-crypto administration. But the details, that is what's causing an overhang, the uncertainty of the details. So to the extent you have confidence, right, about XRP being in that stockpile or otherwise getting more support for an ETF, for example, where does that confidence come from and what kind of timeline do you see it happening on?
So I have immense confidence on the ETF. I think there's 11 different filings pending with the SEC to launch ETFs from everybody from Bitwise to Franklin Templeton and a whole bunch of people in between. I think those will be live in the second half of this year. We have seen, even outside the United States, you have live ETPs. And at a time when a lot of outflows are exiting some of the crypto ETFs, you're seeing inflows into XRP. And I think that's because you had this false negative pressure from the SEC, this kind of, an exogenous hand holding things down that's now being released. And that's great for the market. That's great for builders within the XRP ecosystem globally.
One more on the stockpile.
Yeah.
How much XRP would be in it? Where does it come from?
Well, my understanding of what I read about I think there are some questions, and that the devil may be in the details as Treasury implements some of this.
Absolutely in the details.
But my understanding is that the stockpile will be represented by seized other cryptos other than Bitcoin that then will be in that stockpile. So to the extent that various law enforcement agencies have seized cryptos, which would include XRP, that those would go into the stockpile in addition to the Bitcoin strategic reserve. That's my understanding.
Allora, oltre a tutto questo, se ci fermiamo a riflettere su cosa sta accadendo in questo momento intorno a Ripple, ma anche a XRP, al di là della causa legale, ora che il procedimento si è concluso, credo davvero che vedremo numerose mosse importanti riguardanti Ripple e XRP. In particolare, credo che assisteremo a un grande cambiamento nel mercato cripto, soprattutto a livello degli Stati Uniti e anche e soprattutto per XRP, grazie alla politica fortemente orientata all'innovazione di questa amministrazione. Adesso, anche con una SEC, un congresso che mostrano maggiore apertura verso le criptovalute, la situazione sembra evolversi in maniera significativa. Sembra proprio quasi che stiamo entrando in un mercato completamente diverso. Non voglio ovviamente dire che siamo già in una fase guidata esclusivamente dall'utilità, ma penso che presto XRP finirà al centro di questa scena, mentre Ripple crescerà rapidamente, integrandosi sempre più nel sistema statunitense. E a mio avviso tutto parte da quanto è successo con la SEC. Credo che questo episodio rappresenti uno dei più grandi domino in caduta caduta, quindi proprio il primo tassello che è caduto. D'ora in poi mi aspetto una serie di aggiornamenti rilevanti, soprattutto da parte dei principali istituti bancari. Ora come ora nulla sembra più ostacolare XRP o Ripple e sono molto curioso di vedere quale direzione prenderanno le cose. Come sempre fatemi sapere se vi è trovato utile questo video spaccando il tasto di like, iscrivendovi al canale e attivando la campanella notifiche per non perderti il prossimo video. Ciao!